Welcome back to Conversations of the Leaky Cauldron, Episode 12, Harry Potter and the Order of Phoenix, Chapters 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, and 24. And back with me are my esteemed colleagues, Ms. Sarah Miller, Mr. Wes Schantz. Welcome back, Sarah. Welcome back, Wes. How are y'all doing?
Good. How's it going?
It's going well. Greetings. Welcome back. Cheers to you two. It's good to be back in the old Leaky Cauldron. I got to say, I had sort of a different weekend from usual and was sort of thrown off schedule. And so I'm very happy to be back at our Monday slot, our natural slot that we just keep doing. I mean, it's almost time to make some plans for the summer, I think, getting into March here. And just as this book is sort of chugging along and we got about 119 pages down this time around and we're really moving, and which I'm so impressed about given both of you having, the schedules that you do and the commitments that you do. Being, teachers and also having, you're a writing teacher, Sarah, and that takes quite a bit of time. And, Wes, you and your various commitments, you're now teaching online now and teaching a Silmarillion class. Is that so?
That just started up. It is great because the students have read it more times than I have. So it's not too bad. It's really cool. Yeah. That's on
Outschool, so that might be something I might be interested in taking if it's still possible. How would I do that if I wanted to?
I don't know about grown-ups taking classes on there. I think that's discouraged. It's like for kids, but you could teach a class on there.
So if there were a kid who wanted to sign up for that, or there were a parent who wanted to get up for that, how would they do that?
Yeah, that's just, I think if you Google it, Outschool Silmarillion, it should be the first thing that would come up, I'd think. I don't think there's another one. It's under the Night School account. So I think, click around on there and it'll say somewhere like, sign up for this class. Even though the class started, it was only a week ago. So I think you'd still stand to have a pretty good 6 or 7 weeks left in it, I think. So yeah, if anyone out there wants to do it, go for it.
Well, that sounds great. And is that a book that you've taught before, Sarah? I know that you've taught a fantasy literature course before and done some J.R.R. Tolkien, but did you ever hit the Silmarillion?
I used sections of the Silmarillion, like small little pieces, but I've never taught the text itself. It's so much about world creation as opposed to, and like background myths for Lord of the Rings, that I was working with kids for whom, getting them to do the reading for Lord of the Rings was a big deal. I think Silmarillion is a little more dry, unless you're already into it, in which case it's really exciting. I could be wrong with.
No, you're I think hitting precisely why I think Wes is probably very interested in this text. Especially because we've been talking a lot about world creation, except for in the context of video games. So, okay, well, let's get to this particular secondary world then. And I apologize to the listeners for sort of asking about these new sort of other secondary worlds, but we will be getting to them soon enough. And I'm looking forward to hearing any connections that both of you have about that, because that's a text I haven't touched before. But I did have a very interesting conversation once with our fellow graduate student, Miss Devin Frost, about it, where she was very into the story and she described it very well, and sort of how God sang the world into existence there. And so the Lion and the Serpent, Weasley is our king, as you were singing to us, Wes, and then Hagrid's tale, we finally, and I sort of feel bad about how easily the kids trick Hagrid, but we get his tale and some other stuff happening there, some big stuff, as it were. The Eye of the Snake, St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. We get to meet Neville's parents finally and sort of confront him about our knowledge of that. Christmas on the Closed Ward and Occlumency. So where do y'all want to start? Wes, I know you'd said you had a very particular topic that you wanted to get into, and Sarah, I know you sort of left it open, but now having sort of talked Silmarillion and laid out the chapter titles, where do y'all think would be good? Weasley is our king, talking about the Eye of the Snake. St. Mungo's, a wizarding hospital. A lot of food in front of us. What to dig into first?
I was thinking about the food thing actually. When we said cheers, I was thinking of Hagrid with his dragon steak that's like dripping blood down his face. and how soothing that is for him. And I'm really glad that Hagrid is back. I didn't remember his tale very well. Like I vaguely remember on to, talk to the giants or whatever. But it's pretty brutal, the way that all played out. And I was curious if you guys thought that there was like a particular like allegory going on there, or if it's more just sort of like a story about how brutal politics can be for like oppressed peoples, or like what is that chapter like serving to do aside from getting Hagrid back into the story and explaining where he's been?
I think maybe Sarah, you can actually speak to its narrative function, but I could throw out some sort of symbols that I potentially see that may or may not actually relate. The idea of them being giants, if we wanted to say take a psychoanalytic view of this, could be Hagrid struggling with his own inner nature and whether he should serve Dumbledore, who he is so loyal to, or potentially Voldemort, in that he, it is obviously his people's proclivity to serve the darkness. And insofar as Voldemort is a representation of the darkness in all characters, this could have been the idea that Hagrid is wrestling with himself in the same way that, say, Jacob wrestles with an angel. Now, that said, I think it's a more sophisticated story than that. And so I do think it's very interesting taking the sociological perspective of, say, sort of an indigenous, less sophisticated people that rely on strength. That recalls to me quite a bit the Lystragones and Polyphemus, the Cyclops from the Odyssey. And sort of the story in the Odyssey is that the intelligent man who can see that which that is unseeable with the eyes, who can use his intelligence, can defeat a much stronger opponent. Polyphemus being sort of a barbarian, son of Poseidon, but not even being able to see who is right in front of him. The man Odysseus who will blind him, and not even having the sort of foresight or sight to check underneath his rams when they walk by him, even though one that is usually in the front is in the back, clearly being weighed down by a man hanging beneath it. But, he's so dumb that he does not see what is happening around him even after it has happened. Quite opposite to the Phaeacians, who are actually related to the Cyclopes because they were once giants under the king Eurymedon. But I see sort of that, but I also see sort of a negative or darkness potentially as well in the magical community. And that, again, and this seems to be sort of a big part of this book, house elves, centaurs we'll see later, nearly human creatures as defined by Dolores Umbridge. And these again are creatures that are subjugated by magicians, or have been exiled from their homelands and have been reduced. We would say decimated today incorrectly, because the decimation is a reduction by 1/10, not to 1/10, down to 70 or so members. And then there's sort of the comment that you can't make an accord with them because they're just going to fight and everything's going to get tossed upside down at some point. And then there's going to be potentially a new ruler and you'll have to start negotiations all over. And that just doesn't seem to work. So I'm not yet making the connection to, say, a real group, but I see mythological connections. And it's not because I don't know that they don't exist. I haven't gotten there yet. Sarah, what do you see?
No, I think the mythological connections are interesting. I definitely, I noticed as Hagrid was telling his story that there was this emphasis on the giants' inability, for many of them, their inability to speak English.
Yes.
And that language seemed to be a barrier. And that, I don't know if it's that McNair didn't try to speak to them in English, but, when the Death Eaters approached the new chief, who was far more violent, the original chief received them with English, and it seemed as though part of what was received well was the story of Dumbledore. They'd heard of Dumbledore and his campaign to protect them from unjust laws. I'm forgetting the exact details of the story since it's been a while since I read it. I read it last week, but I do remember that the linguistic barrier seemed significant, and that there were a smaller number of giants who were, keen to listen to Hagrid and Madame Maxime. In terms of like historical parallels or contemporary parallels, I think what it really brought up to me was like colonialism and the giants being othered and rendered savage by virtue of laws, but also by virtue of the difference in customs, the difference in language. Obviously, there are a variety of iterations of colonialism. The British colonial project lasted, 1,000 years in different places. And, the effect of rendering a group of people as other and then legislating how and when they can interact with the rest of the group, I think is like a particularly ironically civilized way of demolishing a group of people. It doesn't require force. Like the magical world didn't have to fight giants. It just had to like push them all into a space where they would kill each other. And that seems to be like kind of a tactic of colonial rule, where you find a way to make the oppressed people oppress themselves. So like makes it easier on the colonial power. And that's sort of what I was thinking of as I was reading The Giants is, just this question of who is savage and who is civilized, and what separates the two of them. It seems to be language, among other things. Seems to be like an attempt to honor customs and norms and like approach with humility. That's sort of what I was thinking about. I don't know if there's like metaphor in there, like a way in which Hagrid's own identity or the things that he wrestles with at Hogwarts are kind of paralleled in the things that he wrestles with out there. I think certainly as a half giant, he faces, he's not welcome in their community just as much as he's not really, like Professor Umbridge makes it quite clear from her like fairly racist demeanor towards him, like,
Yes.
speaking to him like he can't understand language, using her hands and over enunciating to try and communicate with him. Like, again, language becomes this thing that people use to either open up lines of dialogue and diplomacy and to build relationships, or it becomes this thing that you can use to really harm other people. But, that does seem uniquely human, right? Like our skills, our gifts can easily become the things that we use to destroy one another. That's sort of what I was seeing in it.
That's very good. I see the sociological parallel with sort of the theory behind The Wire and Baltimore as well there, with the sort of theory of the oppressor creating conditions in which the oppressed eliminates itself. I wonder if there are also not just nonviolent means, but also sort of assimilating patterns as well. And perhaps that's why in sort of minority cultures, sometimes there is sort of within the culture itself, an antipathy towards assimilation, right? And it becomes sort of a mark of denigration to take on the customs of the so-called oppressor. But and Wes, I'm definitely interested in what you have to say to that. And Sarah, I thought that was very sophisticated and excellent. But the language piece is something I feel like you've also mentioned before, Wes, like the idea of the dark wizards having sort of a parcel tongue and even having their own symbol, the dark mark. And you've brought up the fact that Lord Voldemort is Lord Voldemort to Harry. He's the Dark Lord to the Death Eaters, and he is he who must not be named to non-Death Eaters. And of course, Snape calls him the Dark Lord still, which Harry will call him on eventually. But the language pops up again here, and So what do you do with that?
Oh, I was thinking about the way that it sort of connects with anger. I guess like the way that Umbridge provokes Hagrid, and he doesn't even really rise to it, but she does really insult him to his face and plays off of the students, particularly the Slytherins. But even when she asks a Gryffindor one of her little questions, she'll twist whatever they say, to follow the preconceived idea she's already got, that Hagrid is not fit to be a teacher, and that really makes Hermione, I guess, as angry as probably we've seen her, really, right, at least in a while. And that anger thing is such a big thing in the book. Well, the chapter before, The Lion and the Serpent, we see Harry and I guess it's George Weasley, one of the twins anyway, get overcome, by Malfoy's wicked remarks, and he had been stirring up, Ron the whole game with his song. He got everyone to sing it. That it's not exactly magical, right? But words definitely have a power, and it can be multiplied in lots of ways, by song and by simple mass, and by having the kind of audience that serves for various kinds of nefarious purposes. Usually, I also think that there's something to the kind of privacy that we see going on at Hagrid's house. Umbridge, that is, just barges in there and asserts her authority. He's just gotten home from this long trip, which was hazardous to his health, and she doesn't care at all. That to me is the strongest image of a colonial move so far in the series. But I don't know if Hermione is overcome by her anger in quite the same way as Harry is, but she definitely gets it. Umbridge definitely gets her goat there.
And that seems in line with sort of the theme that she fights for the oppressed and has a real sense of justice as well, I would say. But just sort of tangential to that, when you mentioned the sort of foul comments of Malfoy at the expense of the Weasleys, it's interesting that generally he makes those comments to Ron and Harry, people of his own year, people he's sort of on an equal footing to. He seems to sort of mess up and yet actually really succeed by speaking this way in front of Fred and George this time. And I really like the description that it takes Harry to stop George, and it takes Alicia and I'm looking at it right now here, Katie and Angelina to stop Fred. Malfoy, you messed with the wrong guys. I don't know. There's just something very interesting about seeing Fred and George get fired up as well. We're seeing so many people get angry, and often for just reasons. We've also seen earlier, and I suppose just to keep connecting, Sirius and Molly Weasley get upset at each other. And these, two people who want the best for somebody, not somebody just outright antagonizing someone else in order to serve sort of puerile malevolence like Draco has, or even maybe cunning intelligence. The snake here, he wants to win the Quidditch Cup, so he wants the best players on the team kicked off. I wonder if, his antagonism is not as much boyish sort of roguishness and more actual cunning to get what he wants. But Sarah, what do you do with the anger in this? I know we've talked about it some, but the specific anger that Wes has mentioned and tying it even to Fred and George, and how does that relate to language?
I mean, I think if I understand you all correctly, are you talking about how Malfoy's words can inspire such rage and how we've never seen it in Fred and George?
Malfoy and Umbridge apparently, and I was just sort of throwing in there that Fred and George, I don't know, just sort of I get a thrill from seeing them get mad at someone, because it's can you just imagine? Can you imagine the hell they could on someone?
I think of back to the detention that Dolores Umbridge saddled Harry with, how much words have the power to liberate, but they also have the power to dominate or enslave. You know, the right words delivered in the right place in the right way can provoke, you know, new thought. I mean, in Frederick Douglass's narrative, it's literacy, it's the acquisition of reading and writing capacity that he attributes his eventual bodily freedom to. So, by the way, does Barack Obama in Dreams of My Father talk about education as the source of his, you know, liberation of spirit and mind. It's sort of a common way of thinking about it's sort of a common theme in like the tradition of African American literature, that language has the power to liberate a mind, sometimes long before the body is liberated from slavery. But I think also language has the power to enslave. Fred and George are the two of the freest characters in the entire series, right? They couldn't give two shits about like rules, punishment, expectation, right? Like they are unfettered in a lot of ways, right? There was like when they describe the grading system about the OWLs and how they should have received exceeds expectations just because they showed up, you know, like they don't care about standards. They are free from caring about any of that stuff. When Malfoy makes them so mad, I think it's an example of how you know, language has the power to really dominate and hurt, maybe more so than and in a more insidious way, like getting back to the way we've talked about evil and shadow and how it starts to lurk in places that aren't as obvious or traditional or like seemingly pure villainy, right? But like evil seeps in to these crevices and pockets, and like language does that better than brute blunt force, right? Like because it turns a mind on itself. You know, I think it's a really it's cheesy, but it's a really powerful weapon. I would say that the words that Harry now has etched on his hand, as well as like the language of, I think we talked about it last time, like the language of Percy's letter, the language of the High Inquisitor decrees, the educational decrees, the language of the press, it all can be wielded for good or for evil, and it like seeps into the places where like a swift punch in the face or like a good old like jinx to the body, like those are acts of physical force, but these acts of like mental force are really damaging, and yet for Harry, like the words that are etched onto his hand, it's interesting that those also become like his motivating tool, you know, like he's both incredibly enslaved to her and yet liberated, which I think is the great irony of like how evil functions in fantasy stories, is that they ultimately create the thing or inspire the thing that ends up destroying them. But like they have this inherent weakness. But anyway, that's sort of how I connect language and anger and enslavement, I suppose, and othering. But
that's very powerful. That's extraordinary. And just to focus on what you said at the beginning about sort of a feature, Barack Obama's thought, and who was the thinker before? It wasn't James Baldwin, was it?
No, Frederick Douglass is pretty famous for,
of course,
for this. Yeah. James Baldwin talks, you know, adjacently about it, but I'm not as familiar with his body of work. Richard Wright also talks about it in Black Boy.
Very good. Yeah. And I just see that thought also echoed in Paul's letter of Philemon, where Philemon is, of course, a slave, but he talks about how he's free and that he's a Christian. And so he is a brother to Paul, though he's going to return as a slave, physically speaking. I see that idea very much shared there. And where was it? I also had seen, oh yes, also in the thought of Martin Heidegger, he says language is the house of being. So insofar as one has language, and that means the capacity to articulate one's thoughts, then one is free. And Jordan Peterson recently has become very famous for championing that idea as well, using as one of his sort of basis for that the story of Marduk, who is a Mesopotamian god whose power comes from his eyes around his head and his capacity to speak magic fire words, which is interesting because just in Dante's Inferno, Canto 26, Ulysses, the great teller of stories, the greatest storyteller, as Athena says of Odysseus in Book 13 of the Odyssey, that is why she loves him, because he always keeps his head and is the greatest storyteller that exists. And himself, he values stories so highly that he gives the prize cut of meat to Demodocus of the Phaeacians, their blind singer. And so it's like he is giving credit to Homer for his existence in that moment, who is also, of course, a blind poet. But he is not allowed to speak to Dante because Dante can't speak ancient Greek, or he would be too deceptive. He needed Virgil as intermediary to interpret him. And so insofar as one requires someone else for one's interpretation, one is not master of, say, oneself by that point. And just to sort of tie to that is in Paradiso 26, one gets to talk to Adam, the very first creator of words. So one who first sort of inscribed the fire of language on being. And so I wanted to make some connections with language too, Sarah, because yours was just very profound and powerful. But and so I guess, Wes, which way would you like to go with that? The talking about sort of languages as giving what is it that makes language so powerful that it can enrage, cause pain, enslave, or ultimately liberate?
I guess that's, like, to sum up all of that stuff, maybe we could say like magic or something like that. But
right.
That's possible. In terms of what Umbridge is doing too, though, it's also like the legal profession, right? It's like,
yes,
this thing, this authority, which I have is basically simply because there's some words on a piece of paper, right, signed by a particular person with some words after his name. That way in which, the reverence for an established authority is carried out through words. Obviously, the giants don't really work that way, but among the wizards and among the humans, that seems to be the way it goes. And there's limits to language too, though, right? Like, there's points at which, as you see in Hagrid's lesson, even though he's completely like distracted and keeps losing his train of thought, like, the actual lesson itself is really good because it's right there, right? You can see the hunk of meat getting eaten, even if you can't see what's eating it. And a few of the students can see what's eating it, right? And so there's like, their reality is actually different from that of the other students. And even more to the point, right, their reality is quite different from Umbridge's. Like, her perception of what's going on there is so skewed by her preconceived notion and her desire to get Hagrid in trouble or whatever, belittle him, etc., like, that she can't possibly, learn anything in that moment. Like, oh my gosh, there is this thing there, and I can see it, and other students can't. And the reason. Sorry. I'll just stop there, I guess. Yeah.
No. The reason is where I heard you stop. What was the reason?
That he can, that he's seen death, right? Whereas the others haven't. And so, like, his world has changed since he's had his eyes open to that, right? And the thestrals are like a great metaphor for that.
Yeah, and I want to ask you about the thestrals a little, Sarah. I hadn't thought about this yet, but in what way are the thestrals as something which is invisible to those who have not the experience of death, but are visible to those who have had the experience of death, yet both groups of people can see the effects of them eating the flesh or eating away at something? Is that in some way, how did you interpret that? And do you in some way see that as a metaphor for language as well?
Well, I hadn't quite thought about it as a metaphor for language, but, I'll have to, maybe that will sink in the next few minutes or the next half hour or so. But, I just sort of see the thestrals as a sort of a manifestation of grief, I guess, that for Harry and I guess for Neville and for Luna and for the other boy who had witnessed death, there's things that are ineffable, right? Speaking of language, I guess, but there are things that are where like language fails, as Wes, you said, like some of those I think are really intense emotions. And it doesn't mean that language isn't useful in those scenarios. It just means that we never really feel like, I don't know if you've ever felt this, but when you feel like you don't quite have the words to know what to say to someone who is experiencing a deep emotion, be it grief, maybe the emotion is fear, maybe the emotion is like vaulting love or euphoria or something, or joy. But like sometimes words might feel kind of like you cheapen things, like you return them to earth. And like there's something kind of, I don't know, either subterranean or celestial about these like really intense emotions. And it's possible that like witnessing death doesn't always do that to you, especially if you're like a little kid. But like Harry couldn't see the thestrals until he saw Cedric die, right? He couldn't see them. He was around when his mom and dad died, but for some reason that didn't matter, right? That he only saw them after his fourth year. And maybe that has to do with the capacity to like try and order something that is relatively hard to order. I think as natural as death might be, I think one of the things that words do is they help us map and they help us make sense and they help us order things that are in our world. Just like what we're doing now, trying to order something with language. But for the thestrals, like I can understand. I think what they represent is like the nature of death. That like you can read all you want about it, and you can listen to the songs, and you can look at the art, and you can read all the books. But there's just nothing that will truly prepare you for understanding until you've experienced it up close and personal. And that doesn't even mean losing someone that you love. It means watching it. And I think it stuns you into a kind of silence. Harry has a lot of trouble talking about it. He doesn't even like to talk about what he watched. And I don't know, maybe that's something to play with. Just my 2 cents.
For sure, very strong, and reminds me a bit, Wes, of what we're talking about in Final Fantasy VII with sort of Ares dying right in front of us. Not just there's a character in the video game we play, Sarah, who was killed in front of us, and we've just now started to deal with that appropriately in the game. Our characters sort of coming to grips with that. But Sarah or Wes, what do you do with the thestrals? I sort of asked about the language, and Sarah said she sort of saw them as a manifestation of grief, which I think that's very strong. What do you see?
Yeah, like it's this thing that Hagrid chooses for his first class back. Like Hermione tries to talk him out of doing anything, dangerous or like too advanced, right? She wants him to play it safe, but he's like, "No, I'm not concerned about that. Like I'd rather like do this really interesting, awesome thing." Because I'm Hagrid, that's what I do, right? So that's his lesson, right? It's like showing them this thing, this living thing, that's as powerful as, and sort of undergirds the words of his lesson. And I think that's really important to just like think about, particularly someone like me who gets kind of caught up in just books and words and stuff. There has to be something that they refer to for them to really mean anything. And there has to be like a point of contact where it like can be turned to some kind of activity, right? Or skill or insight that wasn't there before. And so I guess, Harry being able to see them, that was like a puzzle initially for him because he didn't know what that meant. So he kind of started from the thing itself in this case. But I think it's possible to start from the words too and work your way to the thing. At any rate, they're kind of, they need to be commensurate and they need to kind of work together, be coordinated for them to be effective. And the thestral, as we'll see, right, like he'll eventually actually ride it, if I remember right. And I think it's mentioned here that Dumbledore sometimes uses them to travel if he doesn't want to apparate for whatever reason. I find that very interesting.
I found that interesting too, because I suppose it's a discrete way of traveling, going from one place to another due to the grief or despair that one has directly witnessed in one's life. I wonder if that's also the sort of metaphor that's operant in Stranger Things, the second season, when the boy Will, who is clearly a symbol for a traumatized human, travels between the upside down world and this world, or sort of the world of being pulled into his own trauma and going into a different psychic space, even though he is in the physical same space, and becoming completely alone and isolated because of that. And whether this is also sort of a comment on the ability for a trauma or a scar on oneself to take one from the place one is in into another place, or to draw one back into sort of the nether regions of a past memory in which you are still the person you were in that moment and have not yet integrated that wound or that knowledge or the information from it and sort of realized who you are now as opposed to who you were then, whether now you're old and you were once young and you're still acting youthfully, or whether you're now strong and you were once weak and you haven't reintegrated that new knowledge yet.
I think I was going to say that, I don't know if this is where you were going, but that's a great way to integrate or to segue into Harry sort of like feeling like he was taken out of Hogwarts by the feeling embodied by or taking the shape of the snake in
that's chapter. Go on with that. Yeah, go on with that, please.
No, I was just going to say the idea that like one's traumas maybe from what you were saying in Stranger Things, I think that's an apt description of Will, someone who's haunted, right? And who for whom what they have experienced in the case of Will, it's not the same as the case of Harry, but for Harry, it's what haunts him, it seems, is that he played such a key role in the resurrection
yes.
of an evil being. Like his body, something from his body was taken from him against his wishes and contributed to the rise of this evil being, or the resurrection of this evil being. The very opposite of the only thing in his life that he's wanted resurrected, which is the good being, his parents, right?
Right. And it's like a rape in that way.
Yeah, and he feels, I might be psychoanalyzing, but I think he feels an enormous amount of guilt that he couldn't stop Cedric from being killed, that he couldn't stop Voldemort from taking his blood, and that now the one thing that has always protected him, i.e. his blood, is not a protection anymore. And I think he feels this enormous guilt, so I think he's haunted by it. He's clearly governed beyond his brain by his anger over this experience, by his anger at people's inability to understand his experience and at his inability to translate that experience into something that other people could understand, i.e. using language. And like
right.
so all of these angers sort of compound on one another, and they become this vicious kind of hound within him. And he's not as in control of himself as, and to be fair, a 15-year-old, like, you know, they're not really in control of themselves anyway, but he's certainly not. He's certainly struggling with that. And I think when he's in the middle of this dream, just before he arrives and what he learns is the Department of Mysteries, he is like facing a variety of social failures, right, in this dream. And I think he's just like constantly haunted by things, and they become a wormhole for him. I don't know if I have anywhere else to go with that, but I thought what you were suggesting about trauma does relate nicely to the thing where he sort of feels like he's embodying something else because so against his will was forced to become like to share body with
Yes.
to share his body with something so evil.
That was going to be my follow-up question to Wes. What extent do you see the connection between what Sarah just said and the fact that Harry is literally now the father of darkness? His his blood has been taken from him by force in a rapacious act, and then used to inseminate, essentially, and reconstitute and resurrect the Dark Lord. So that which he once destroyed unconsciously and not by his own will, he is now resurrected not by his own will. And do you see a connection between that and Harry sort of fathering darkness or evil in his surroundings through giving way to anger? Or do you see it in a different way, or do you see a connection there? What do you think, Wes?
I guess there's probably something going on with that. I hadn't thought about it in quite that way, but you know, when he's a baby, he does sort of take Voldemort's life in a way, but like unconsciously, right? And then when he's on the cusp of puberty here, it's taken back from him, right? Voldemort gets his life back and then some. He kills Cedric while he's at it and almost kills Harry. And, you know, he does seem to have some element of Harry in him now. As you're talking about, you know, the sexual component of the story comes up right in this moment too, in the Eye of the Snake chapter where we've been talking about. There's sort of like three big eye or seeing like images there. The first is seeing the thestrals, and then the third is seeing, you know, from the snake's point of view, the attack on Arthur. But in between, there's this moment where he's left alone with Cho Chang in the room of requirement after their last DA meeting of the, you know, before the break. And she starts to cry about, you know, having all these emotions that Harry's having trouble understanding. He's got plenty of emotions of his own, but he just can't quite make that, you know, leap at this point. So then she just goes ahead and gives him the kiss, right? And that like overpowers him. It stops the narrative. It's so powerful. There's just the break as she's coming in for the kiss, and he can see every tear clinging to her eyelashes, right? So there's this eye image there too. It's not exactly the eye of the snake, but insofar as Harry, you know, has contributed to now this rise of Voldemort again, and insofar as Harry is responsible for the Dumbledore's army, right? This whole kind of mobilization in a smaller way of the kind of thing the Order of the Phoenix is trying to do. And we'll see this again when he goes upstairs to visit Dumbledore finally. He looks at Dumbledore and gets this rage when their eyes meet. You know, so there is definitely something going on between the perception and the intention or the sort of soul that is transmitted by that, how that all relates to the body and, life and generation. Like there's a lot there. I don't know that I've got a particularly good handle on it. I mean, I think the sort of the images are all pointing that direction though, and there's definitely something there.
I think that's very strong, and you just make me think of, not to be too crude, but of course the eye of the snake is a vulgar metaphor, right? The one-eyed monster, which is also what a cyclops is, in a Freudian way, as a metaphor for, which is very interesting. Also, of course, the eyes of the snake, the basilisk, are what petrified and turned one to stone in the second book. And we sort of interpreted that in a Medusian way, that sort of certain things in nature, particularly the female gaze to the male, has a petrifying effect, because that is the force of selection on a male. And generally the force is strong and says, nope, not you. But also just another connection to that is Lynn Isabel, a primatologist, or rather, I guess she's a herbologist, from UCLA, claims that humans developed, or as primates, better vision due to being able to detect the patterns on snakes' back in their lower field of vision. So in areas with higher snake populations, you see creatures with better vision. And humans as primates have the best vision of any of them. So we must have fought against the most snakes, which is one of the ideas why we have so many snakes, including dragons, in all of our mythologies. Because as creatures that have been around for millions of years, we've fought a lot of snakes, which I think is sort of interesting. But there was one other thing about snakes that I wanted to mention, or the eye of the snake. Oh yes, there's a contrast here between, and of course the snake is renowned for its cunning biblically, so it is a very aware creature. And that also, I think, connects nicely to the fact that snakes are so cunning, and they ate a lot of our young over a historical time. And recently there was a video going around about one catching a crow, which is pretty gnarly in Australia, thank God. But Dante locates the eye in which the just rulers are in cantos 18 to 20 of the Paradiso in an eagle, so which is, a contrasting image to the snake. In fact, the Mexican flag with a snake in the talons of an eagle, I think, indicates a great tension amongst their people. That's an image from Zarathustra as well, by Nietzsche, of a snake being in the talons of an eagle. And sort of the Jungian interpretation of that, and Jung's seminar on that, was that, well, the snake belongs on the ground, not in the talons of an eagle. That's not a good position for the snake. And in fact, in the Iliad, a snake is dropped by an eagle that then becomes angry and will get vengeance on the eagle. And that's supposed to be a sign for the Trojans sort of angering the Achaeans, but the Achaeans going to come back in force. And so, so Sarah, I'm not exactly sure where that leaves me with a question. What sorts of connections do you see? I mean, the snake image is just so rich, and even especially in the story. And I mean, even just as a basic question, is this Nagini character? I know we found out something about her in the most recent Fantastic Beasts. Is she a basilisk? Because I don't feel like she has. Does she have the petrifying vision? And then anything else you want to add to that, please do, because this has been a very rich conversation.
Yeah, I don't think that Nagini is a basilisk. I think that would have been more, potently
right
and prominently featured, I think, in the narrative. Like, I don't think we would have a question about that.
Right.
Just to like go for full circle, I think, not full circle, but like return us to something that we talked about a lot in when we read the second book, that something that Harry and Voldemort share is their capacity to understand the language of a snake. And
yes.
To be able to take all of the hissing and to turn it into something meaningful, kind of like how Harry can see the thestrals and can derive meaning from that when other people can't. Like, he has access to to knowledge, be it through language or through the sense of his vision. He can see and understand and hear things that other people can't. And I don't know that I have much more to add to the idea of the snake. I certainly in the Bible it is the source of evil, not because it itself is evil, but because it tempts Adam and Eve to make a choice that is contrary to the law of God, right? So don't eat the fruit from the tree of good and evil, or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I think it highlights that the snake to me always. I always think of the screw tape letters, just because because it's associated with the devil and et cetera. But Wes, I'm not sure if you've read those, but the among the many things in the letters is this idea that like language can divide, and if you say the right thing to the human, he or she will be tempted away from the ways of God. And I think the idea of a snake to me highlights free choice, and how important that is, how powerful of a tool that is for good or for evil, and that sort of circles back to the theme of language that we were talking about earlier. But I don't know that I have anything else to add besides that.
Well, that's pretty strong. Well, we're at an hour now, and I really do want to talk about occlumency, but do you all think that we should leave that off for next time and conclude with something fun? Like, I feel like I asked a question like this to you all and it just didn't go that well, but I asked something like, if you were a wizard and you were celebrating Lent, so tomorrow would be Fat Tuesday for you, as it is in our world, our primary world, and then that would be followed by 40 days of abstaining from something. I think I asked, what sort of spell would you abstain from? But I guess the first question I want to ask is, Sarah, are you observing Lent this year? And if so, what are you giving up?
Wow, Alex, put me on the spot with the public displays of faith. Yeah, I'm observing Lent. I usually do. I tend not to give up stuff, but to I maybe abstain from certain ways of thinking or behaving. I'm sort of past the point where giving up candy is like spiritually fruitful or whatever. So I understand how give up coffee or pop or whatever. If it doesn't bring you closer to God, then it doesn't work. It's a waste. That's not a useful sacrifice. It's supposed to remind you of the sacrifice of Christ. So I tend to add something on to my life. And so I do a Lenten prayer practice, and I tend to find a way to spend an hour a week in more direct service to the poor and marginalized, even though, an hour is not always easy to give in that respect. I don't want to make it sound like I'm in any way some kind of, do-gooder or, perfect Catholic or whatever. And in fact, the Catholic Church and I are not on speaking terms at the moment, but yeah, I like to observe it for my own self. And if I were a wizard and I had to abstain from, okay, this is a small thing. So one of the things I am going to abstain from, but not because I just want to give it up, but because I need to break the habit, and I'm going to try and use the money for some kind of almsgiving. Is buying coffee in the morning is not a good use of my money as much as I love it. And I need to stop. It's an indulgence that is not necessary during the week. So my intention is to give that up. And that reminds me, one of the reasons I do that in the morning is because I'm always so cold, and my classroom is so godforsaken cold that I want something hot to hold on to as long as possible. That spell that Hermione does to heat up the walkway, to melt the snow, or heat up her clothes, I don't even think we get a word. I would use that all the time. If I could like heat up my socks, or like the sweatshirt that I'm wearing right now, if I could like make it warm, I would be using that. I would be abusing that spell. I'd probably have to give that one up. But I'm sure that there's like a more serious one that I could give up as well.
What a sophisticated response. You're really giving me some food for thought there, because I almost take more pleasure in the idea behind your action than the action yourself, because I was sort of just fighting with the triteness of giving up something just to give something up. But with the idea behind it, perhaps I could do something more. I'll have to do some thinking tonight. But Wes, I suppose I should be fair. And are you observing Lent and giving anything up? And were you a wizard and you were going to observe Lent? Can you think of something you would give up? And maybe not even just a spell, just anything that you might have access to in the wizarding world.
Ooh, man, I don't know. I don't think I've ever observed Lent. I was looking at some photos from the carnival in Brazil. So I guess in some sense I was like vaguely aware that it must be happening, because if there's carnival, then there's Lent, right? That's how that works.
Right.
I didn't even put that together, to be honest. I was like, oh, these are some really colorful pictures. I'm gonna look at these. I'm pretty much a heathen, I gotta say. But I do love getting to eat pancakes. Like, any excuse to eat a lot of pancakes is fine by me. I'm gonna, continue doing basically my routine. It's working for me pretty well right now, where I have to go out and do my chicken chores. We've got a couple of chickens now, and they have not been laying eggs all winter. You still got to like take care of them though. But they have recently started laying eggs again. So that's exciting to me. Like, I like it when chores are not just a thing that you have to do, but that you actually, have some benefit from doing them. Or at least you avoid some negative of not doing them, right? So, like, to your point about like, giving something up is supposed to actually like accomplish something, or else there's no point in really doing it. Yeah, I totally concur with that. And I feel like you can sort of, put up with a lot if you see a reason for it. So anyway, that's just like a small example, I guess. But if I were, a wizard and I was to give up some aspect of wizarding, I don't know. I like how pretty cool. It's chaotic and give up apparating. It's easy because I've never been able to apparate, so I wouldn't miss it much, I guess. But like, what an amazing power. Like, of all the wizarding powers, that one is up there, like with time turning, right? Like controlling time and space itself. And so I guess, yeah, apparition, I would let go of that and just, ride my thestral around for 40 days or whatever it is.
Very good. Very good. And I see why you want to play Zelda so much with the very famous chicken catching scenes. I don't know that happens in Majora's Mask. It does in Ocarina of Time, though, so that's pretty funny. Yeah, did you have something to say about that? Yeah. Oh, yeah, Sarah?
I was just gonna say that one year, a couple in college, a couple of friends of mine and I gave up the elevator just to, like, as a primary world example of that. And like, having to take the stairs every day, like everywhere, was not easy. So I applaud that choice, Wes, like giving up apparating, like the easy way of traveling, sitting in your thestral / car in traffic,
Yeah. And you two would just make me thinking about your differing ways of interpreting the task, that, my favorite saint is Saint Christopher, because when a monk told him that the best way to serve the Lord was to fast and pray, he said, I'm not going to do that. And so he was given a task more appropriate to his extraordinary size and strength, which was to help people cross a river, sort of like what the Buddha is known to have done with people, and sort of like the allegory of the cave. But that makes me think that how I would, of course that resonates with me, and the sort of person I am is it makes me want to accomplish something over the next 40 days. So maybe something mental or maybe something physical, something that is demanding upon my time. It also brings me closer to the logos, or that which is divine, in a way that is particular to my own gifts and my own way of being in this world. And so maybe 40 podcasts over 40 days, or something physical as well. Maybe run something like a half marathon and train for that, and bring myself closer to the fount of all being by being as much as I can be. And it's interesting to what extent one learns about oneself through the sacrifices one endures voluntarily. I think, and I think that'll be something that we'll start seeing in the next few chapters too. What is worth sacrificing for? What is worth even potentially dying for? And maybe that's something that every person who needs a reason why, a raison d'etre, needs. And maybe that makes for a good life too. Well, y'all.
Yeah.
And I guess magically what I would give up is, I don't know yet. And I guess that's not a cop out, but, or that is a cop out. So, yeah, I'd give up riding my broom. I'm an athlete, as you all know, and I like to play my sports. And so, just to say exactly the opposite of what I might suggested I would do in the primary world, is maybe I'd give up playing Quidditch for 40 days and hit the books or something like that. So still operate around save my time, but give up something that, I take a lot of joy in, my sports.
Yeah, man. Yeah. I hope that you are able to find something that is like worth doing every day. Podcasting sounds like a good one. I mean, I don't think I can do a Harry Potter podcast every day, but you could definitely find a topic for each day of the week. I don't doubt it.
Yeah. And, we're not so far away from that as it is. So maybe some serious thinking going to be happening. I'm going to have to hit the pensieve a bit after this. Get rid of some extraneous thoughts and then really get into it. So, okay, well then let's start with occlumency next time. And we've been really clipping along. Where should we get to for this next time? 25, 26, 27, 28 looks pretty interesting. Snape's worst sense memory. 29, career advice. There's a big fight between McGonagall and Umbridge there, which would be fine. And do we want to get to 30 and Grop? That's pretty healthy chunk of reading if we do.
I think we should certainly get through Snape's worst memory, because I think that's like a tandem setting to occlumency, since we didn't talk about it. We also didn't really talk about like anything that we learned at Christmas. Christmas on the word, and all of that. I think that we'll have some stuff to talk about that maybe from the chapters. So I would be okay with like fewer chapters, just because there's more to discuss. But I'm also happy to keep going at like the 6th chapter, 5 or 6 chapters a clip.
That sounds like good reasoning.
Yeah. I think up through the end of 28, if we could, that would probably be plenty.
Yeah. All right.
I think that'd be plenty to talk about for sure.
And then we can hit a couple of the pieces that we didn't have time for today during our discursion on language. I guess we had a few words to say about language. Like you said, Sarah, perhaps that, or Wes, that perhaps that is the greatest magic. Perhaps that is the greatest spell. Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, well, much manna, much food for thought tonight. Thanks for helping to clothe me in some virtue and bring me beyond the mundane, fellow pocketeers and or leaky cauldronites at this point. Cauldronians? In any case, salute and bottoms up, y'all.
All right. Have a good one.
All right. Cheers.
Cheers.
Have a good night.
Later.